Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison near Cape Town after 27 years behind bars. The images are iconic. Him raising his fist alongside Winnie, the massive crowd of 100,000 people waiting for hours at Cape Town City Hall, the speech he delivered calling for continued armed struggle even as he stood free. Most people know this story as the moment when apartheid began to crumble. And it was. But here's what really gets my attention. Mandela's release wasn't a moral awakening. It was a calculated gamble by a regime that had concluded apartheid was no longer economically sustainable. That distinction matters more than you might think. Because understanding why de Klerk freed Mandela tells us something crucial about how systems actually change, not through sudden enlightenment, but through the slow accumulation of pressure that makes the old way of doing business impossible to maintain. Picture this. It's the evening of February 10th, 1990. De Klerk summons Mandela to a secret meeting and tells him he's being released the next day. Mandela, who's been negotiating for this moment for years, is caught completely off guard. In his autobiography, he wrote, "I deeply wanted to leave prison as soon as I could, but to do so on such short notice would not be wise." He wanted time to prepare, to consult with his organization, to plan. De Klerk said, "No, it's happening tomorrow." Think about that dynamic. The man who'd been imprisoned for nearly 3 decades wanted to slow things down. The president who'd built his career defending apartheid wanted it done immediately. That reversal tells you something about who actually held the leverage at that moment. Let me build the clock for you. In 1948, the National Party came to power in South Africa with apartheid as its explicit platform, codifying racial segregation that had existed informally for decades into a comprehensive legal system. By 1964, when Mandela was sentenced to life in prison for sabotage, the system seemed unshakable. The Cold War gave the white government international cover. They positioned themselves as a bulwark against communism, and Western powers mostly looked the other way. The economy was strong. Gold prices were hitting record highs. They had the resources to maintain control through force. But systems always have cracks, and pressure finds those cracks. Through the 1970s, and especially the 1980s, multiple forces converged. Internally, township uprisings made the country increasingly ungovernable. The Soweto Uprising in 1976, the formation of the United Democratic Front, the constant strikes and protests, these weren't just moral statements. They made it expensive and difficult to maintain order. Meanwhile, the Cold War was ending. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, South Africa lost its main argument for Western tolerance. They couldn't play the anti-communist card anymore. Then came the economic pressure. In 1986, the U.S. Congress overrode Reagan's veto to pass the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. The European Union imposed sanctions. More damaging than the official sanctions, though, was what happened with private capital. In 1985, Chase Manhattan and other major banks, sensing instability, refused to roll over $14 billion in short-term loans. South Africa faced potential default on its international obligations. That was the moment when apartheid stopped being economically viable. F.W. de Klerk came from apartheid aristocracy. His uncle had been prime minister. His father served in the cabinet under 3 apartheid leaders. He'd spent his career implementing the system, including as education minister, overseeing the deliberately inferior Bantu education for black South Africans. When he became president in 1989, nobody expected what came next. In August 1989, 6 months before Mandela's release, de Klerk had a private meeting with U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Hank Cohen. In that conversation, de Klerk was remarkably candid. He said he'd grown up under apartheid, made his career under it, had no apologies for it, but, and this is the crucial part, he'd recently become a grandfather, and looking at his grandson, he realized there was no future under the current system. The way de Klerk framed it to Cohen wasn't about morality, it was about survival. He said explicitly that apartheid wasn't going to work anymore and changes had to be made. This is where it gets interesting. De Klerk didn't see himself as dismantling white power. He thought he could negotiate something called power sharing, a constitutional setup that would enfranchise black South Africans while building in white veto power to protect minority interests. He wasn't planning to hand over control. He was planning to reform the system just enough to relieve the pressure while maintaining essential protections for white South Africans. Mandela outmaneuvered him completely. Over the next 4 years of negotiations, de Klerk kept trying to preserve special constitutional protections for whites. Mandela and the ANC kept pushing for full majority rule. The breakthrough came when de Klerk's chief negotiator, Roelf Meyer, and the ANC's Cyril Ramaphosa built a working relationship based on trust. Eventually, de Klerk accepted that unqualified majority rule was the only path forward. The 1994 elections put Mandela in power, and de Klerk became deputy president in the Government of National Unity. I find myself thinking about Mandela's speech at Cape Town City Hall on the day of his release. He'd been in prison since 1962, 27 years, and the first major thing he said in that speech? Our resort to armed struggle in 1960 was purely defensive against the violence of apartheid. The factors which necessitated armed struggle still exist today. We have no option but to continue. He praised de Klerk for going further than any previous nationalist president, but he made it clear the armed struggle wasn't over. He was drawing a line. This is good, but it's not enough. The pressure continues. That takes remarkable discipline. To stand there after 27 years in front of 100,000 people celebrating your freedom and say, we're not done. And here's what troubles me about how this story usually gets told. It gets reduced to a simple narrative about a good man and his moral example. Mandela was indeed extraordinary. His lack of bitterness, his commitment to reconciliation while never compromising on core principles. His political skill, all of it was essential. But if we focus only on individual virtue, we miss the systemic lesson. Apartheid didn't end because de Klerk had a change of heart. It ended because a combination of internal resistance, international sanctions, economic pressure, and geopolitical shifts made the system unsustainable. When Nelson Mandela himself was asked whether economic sanctions helped end apartheid, he replied, "Oh, there is no doubt. Not moral persuasion, not appeals to conscience, economic pressure that made the status quo impossible to maintain." The white South African government conducted a survey in 1986 asking whether sanctions should lead to concessions. Only 30% of whites said yes. The vast majority opposed making concessions specifically because of sanctions. They saw it as giving up everything. Yet less than 4 years later, they did give up everything, not because their views changed, but because continuing the fight had become untenable. We're still living with the contradictions of this transformation. De Klerk spent the rest of his life in a complicated position. He won the Nobel Peace Prize alongside Mandela in 1993, but he never fully reckoned with the violence the apartheid state committed. At the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when evidence emerged of systematic torture, assassinations, and human rights abuses by security forces, de Klerk insisted he didn't know. Archbishop Tutu pressed him. Given the widespread and systemic nature of these abuses, how could you not have known? De Klerk never gave a satisfying answer. When de Klerk died in 2021, he left a video message apologizing without qualification for apartheid's harm. But to many black South Africans, he remained the last apartheid president, someone who'd done the pragmatic thing when forced to, but never truly confronted the moral horror of the system he'd defended for decades. Mandela's calculation was different. He understood that to build a functioning, multiracial democracy, he needed white South Africans on board. So he practiced radical forgiveness without forgetting. He invited his former prison guards to his presidential inauguration. He wore a Springbok jersey, the symbol of Afrikaner nationalism, to the 1995 Rugby World Cup. Helping to unite the country, he established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission not to punish, but to create a public record of what happened. Think about the position Mandela was in. He spent 27 years in prison, much of it breaking rocks in a quarry on Robben Island. The apartheid system destroyed families, killed thousands, and subjected millions to systematic degradation. He had every reason to want vengeance. Instead, he chose a different path. Not because he was soft, but because he understood that sustainable change required building something new, rather than just tearing down the old. Both things are true. Mandela's moral leadership was extraordinary and necessary, and it worked only because systemic pressures had already made apartheid unsustainable. You can't separate the individual from the institutional forces. They work together. The political violence didn't stop with Mandela's release. Over the next 4 years, more than 10,000 people were killed, almost all of them black South Africans. Much of this violence was between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party, a Zulu nationalist movement. Evidence later emerged that the apartheid government provided covert support to Inkatha, deliberately stoking the violence to weaken the ANC's position at the negotiating table. Negotiations broke down multiple times. The transition was messy, painful, and far from inevitable. What strikes me is how Mandela navigated those 4 years. He had to maintain the armed struggle as leverage while pursuing negotiations. He had to keep international sanctions in place while signaling the change was coming. He had to manage internal ANC politics, where many activists thought he was moving too slowly or compromising too much. He had to build trust with de Klerk while calling out the government's ongoing violence. It was an extraordinarily complex balancing act, and one misstep could have plunged the country into civil war. South Africa's transition is often held up as a model of peaceful change, and in many ways it was, especially compared to what could have happened. But peaceful is relative. 10,000 people died in political violence during the transition period. The economic inequalities created by apartheid persist decades later. Land reform has been incomplete and contentious. The dream of a multiracial democracy has been only partially realized. All of those things are true. The transition was a remarkable achievement. It was also incomplete and imperfect. Both statements matter. There's a lesson here about how change actually happens. We tend to prefer stories about moral awakening, the idea that people or institutions see the light and choose to do better. Those stories are appealing because they suggest change is primarily about convincing people, about winning hearts and minds. But South Africa tells a different story. Change came when continuing the old way became impossible. Not immoral, but impossible. That doesn't diminish the role of moral resistance, the internal protests, the international solidarity movement, the cultural boycotts, the economic sanctions. All of that created the pressure that made apartheid unsustainable. Moral arguments mattered enormously, but they mattered because they were backed by concrete pressure that made the system unworkable. When we think about systems that need changing today, this distinction is crucial. Moral appeals alone rarely transform entrenched systems. What changes systems is making the status quo more costly to maintain than reform. That's not cynical, it's realistic. And understanding it helps us think strategically about how change actually gets made. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, think about this. What systems in your life are maintained, not because people believe in them, but because changing them feels too costly? What would make the cost of maintaining them higher than the cost of change? And what's the difference between compromising your principles and choosing strategic patience to achieve them? Because that's what February 11th, 1990 teaches us. Not just about one man's freedom, but about how seemingly permanent systems finally break when the forces holding them in place shift. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.